Okay guys, this is gonna be our zinc assembly video. Woot woot. All right guys, this is gonna be our zinc assembly video. All right guys, this is gonna be our zinc assembly video. This is going to be an overall build guide that will be in-depth enough that you can follow along, but not so in-depth that it bores you. The Zinc is a great design. 118 Design has done amazing work on this. This is the Zinc 2.0. He did the Zinc 1.0 first, and so he learned a lot from it, and he took a lot of those principles and applied them here. The Zinc, I think, is a really fun build because it's quick and it's easy and it works. I've done some modifications on these print files. I actually did a video on those changes, and so all the parts you see here are ones I have done changes on. So if you have your own prints that maybe aren't dialed in, or the original prints, you may have to do a lot more tinkering or filing to get them to work. With these file sets and this hardware, this build goes pretty smoothly. Some of the hardware is different than what 118 Design originally had in mind. However, a lot of it still works in these print files. His pins are just a bit bigger, or his springs a bit looser, and so you can kind of interchange hardware where necessary. But this hardware, like 440 screws, 116 pins, and a 440 flathead, those are similar to the Caliburn and Spring Thunder hardware. So if you've built those before, or you have extra parts lying around, you might already have a lot of the hardware needed. There are some custom parts, like a CNC plunger core that he made and designed, which is a really unique part that the Zinc is built around, and O-rings you may not have lying around, or the thumb nut, but a lot of the hardware is pretty universal, the springs and O-rings, and so it's really an easy build. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and start, but before you do, I'm going to do a full disclosure on the tools that you need. If you do have tight prints or things that don't fit quite as well, you're going to need some less than average screwdriver tools to get the job done. So I usually use a file. Obviously, you're gonna need a screwdriver for your screws. If you have the original hardware, then you'll need a set of hex keys. But here I've switched them out for Phillips because that's a little bit more standard. You're gonna need a pair of pliers, as well as a wrench or wrench set for the hex on the plunger core to tighten it. Because if I use, these pliers that have a serrated kind of edge, then I find it'll score the plunger pretty bad and kind of ruin the niceness and the cleanness of the plunger. I'm gonna go get that wrench. You'll also need super glue to attach your magnets. And here's a wrench. Here's the regular wrench, 7/16 size wrench, or I've got here this pipe wrench, so it's adjustable, which I like to use for a lot of projects. That is all the tools you'll need. It helps to have a mallet or a hammer, something to tap with. I like to use my wrench to kind of tap gently if it's a tight fit on some of the parts, but overall it goes together pretty smooth. So let's dive into it. I like to do the frame first, the lower frame, just so everything has a place to sit when I assemble it. I've made some changes to this print, so I'm just gonna build this as if I was gonna build my own Zinc with these prints as well. Yours might be slightly different if you use the original files, so you can follow 118 Design's build instructions PDF instead, or just use these files. If you got your hardware kit from me, or your DIY kit, your prints or your DIY kit from me, then you'll have these files, and so your build should go hopefully as smoothly as this one hopefully will as well. First, I'm going to take my mag release and make sure it fits into the frame. This frame printed out with a bit of overhang and goobers there, so I'm going to file those away. Depending on how you tune your printer, you should have a lot less goobers in the way. I would recommend to build any 3D printed blaster, especially ones with tight tolerances like the Zinc, to try to get your printers dialed in before you try to go ahead at it. So I'm just going to file those goobers down, get some room in there. That's just the overhang. You could print with supports, that works too. And see how it fits. It should slide in fairly easily. That's pretty good. It's still a little tight, so I'd probably hit the corners a little bit. What you can do also is file the corners of the mag release itself, which I find to be a little bit easier to get to on the corners, unless you have a really small round file. So it is easier usually to sand the mag release than it is to sand the frame, depending on what tools you have available to you. You want to have the hole facing towards you for the right-handed version. Now we'll install the mag release spring and the trigger guard. So what you can do is take a small 440 nut and put it on the spring. So we'll take our 440 flathead, the longer one, and put our mag spring just like this. And then what 118 design originally intended for is to take the hex nut and also put it in there with the spring and then screw it onto the screw, so that way you can pull on it to install the trigger guard, which acts as the backstop for the spring. You put your mag release, your trigger guard on, then you pull, screw this on, and then you pull, and then the trigger guard sits in, and then you just take the screw out. And there it is. Now you can see the mag release is a bit stiff, so I probably want to go back here and file that a little more, or add some lube. Then you can secure the trigger guard with a 1/16 inch pin, and I like to use my screwdriver and kind of tap it into place if it's tight. Push it into place, a little tap tap. Perfect. So there's the frame. Next we'll do the trigger, and the trigger sits along the barrel in here. So I'll first make sure that my trigger slides on the barrel. That's pretty good. That'll work. And I might, if it is a bit tight, then you can sand the inside or file the inside of your trigger. So now it fits even better, nice and loose. Then the spring will fit around that. Perfect. The other thing to check is the fit of your trigger in your frame. It should be loose in the frame, so it should slide back and forth. That's pretty good. It gets stuck a little bit, so if yours is too tight, you can file the sides of the trigger. The Zinc 1.0, I heard reports that it had a really stiff trigger pull, so getting these parts to fit well goes a long way in making that smoother. That's even better. And failing that, you could also use a drop of lube. I recommend using lube on any moving parts. It just helps it glide a little bit better. So I put a little bit of lube on the sides of the trigger, maybe in the slots where the trigger slides in the frame. Just a little bit, and then a little bit on the inside of the trigger where the barrel rides on it. Now we would install the trigger first into the top, just like that. Then a trigger spring in the front or in the back of the trigger. And the barrel just slides in the front. Now you might have one end that's kind of chamfered more than the other, because that will be the loading end, where the dart has a wider entrance than the exit. So I want to put that side in first. And it should fit. And if it's too tight, again, you want to go through and sand the inside of your frame. And this one is a bit tight. Use your file. You want that barrel to slide in, kind of like a push fit. Ah, perfect. You push it most of the way by hand. When it gets towards the end, I like to give it a rap tap with a mallet, something soft. Or you can use your little wrench here. When it gets close to the bottom, about this far, you need it to go through this bridge in the frame. So a lot of times I found the barrel will kind of sit upwards, and then if you hit it too hard, then you end up breaking this middle piece of the frame. You have to get a new frame. So when I tap it, I found it best to push down on the barrel so that it seats properly into the frame. There you go. If I didn't push down, then I probably would have broken my frame. So now I can test the trigger, make sure it slides still, and it slides. So we're good. If it is a bit stiff, you may want to put some more lube in there, or you could pull out the barrel. I found two ways to do that. If it's really tight, you can use a 1/2 inch rod, like a ram core or a socket, and push it from the back by hammering on the plastic at the front. Or if it's loose enough, I found that you can actually just take a pair of pliers, like needle nose, and stick it in there. You might score up the inside of the barrel a little bit, but then you can add some force to it and then pull out. I'm trying not to use too little force where your pliers are then scraping the inside of the barrel. So you can pull and then slide out. If it's too tight, go with hitting it from the back. So stick a caliber ram core or something like that in the back, something that's wider than the inside of the barrel, and then hit it from the back. So this one works just fine. So last thing I'm gonna do is put in the mag eject system, which is on the bottom of the handle. I'm gonna use the 1-inch long compression spring, and it should just slide right in. It's a bit tight, you can widen it with a drill bit, and then I'll take one of my 1/16 pin, the other pin. It needs to be about 2/3 of the length of a caliber pin, so you can snip that with a pair of pliers or cut it. And as I push down the spring, I'll insert the pin from the side. And that pin will help that spring stay in. There we go. So now when I put a magazine in, and a lot of that rubbing sound is the print's not being broken in. I found that it gets quieter over time. And it ejects faster as well as the prints get broken in. So that's the frame. Next, we'll do the internals and I guess the top of the frame. So you can see that these parts haven't been post-processed yet. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that. I'm gonna grab a pair of pliers and just break off this built-in brim here, kind of gently. And then when I've got a little bit left, I'll just go ahead and use a knife and kind of cut it nice and clean, or a pair of scissors. So I'll just kind of clean it up. What I'll do next is check to make sure the slide will slide on the frame without resistance. If it's too tight, I might need to sand the slide or the top frame. So just slide on. That's pretty good. It's a little tight, but not bad at all. Now when I put the plunger tube in, it tends to bow out the top slide a little bit, so you'll get a little bit more resistance. So next thing I like to do is put the plunger tube in, bend these out a little bit. Don't push too hard. You just want to bend the top just barely enough so you can slide the plunger tube in. If you bend it too far, you'll definitely crack and break your slide. And depending on what you print with as well. Some prints are more brittle than others. That worked just fine. And then we'll see, is it still loose? Yeah, still is. So the original file set, I had to sand mine a lot on those rails to get the slide smooth, but now we've got pretty good function. Now it does seem a little bit tight as we go towards the last inch or two, but I think that's okay. The rest kind of gravity drops in the second half. So you could sand that bottom there or sand the front if that bothers you. I prefer my slide to stay put. There are magnets that hold it, but that's definitely good. If that sliding noise also bothers you, you can use some lube. Also with prints on prints rubbing, I've noticed that if you slide it a couple times, you'll eventually, create some heat and melt the prints a little bit. That'll help break in the prints. And then as they cool, then you'll be able to have a more of a slide fit as you rub them and break them in. Next, let's do the catch and the rest of the internals. So the front piece here, your thumb nut should fit into this slot here. It'll be a nice tight fit, so give that a wrap tap. And it should lock into place, and that'll fit your smooth rod. Now your smooth rod is threaded on two ends. One is longer than the other. So this one's threaded 1/4 inch, this one's threaded a little more, and that little more side is going to go into that front piece, into the thumb nut. So make sure it screws in nice and smooth, and if it doesn't, you may need to drill out this hole for the smooth rod a little wider. I found 9/64 works great. So if your holes are too tight, drill in the 9/64 for the smooth rod. Same in the frame. But they work great in these modified prints, so we're good. Now the catch and the catch plate. The catch sits in this orientation here, so the little finger is pointed down, and the catch spring is oriented so that you have like the V shape of the spring going towards the direction of the finger, if that makes any sense. And then that goes down into the front piece. What I like to do is give it a wiggle to try to set that spring down low where it needs to go. And then we'll drive our 1-inch screw through the side, through the catch finger, and then through the middle of the spring. Not sure how well you can see that, but want to make sure that the screw goes through the spring and it doesn't just end up squishing the spring. So I'll screw it in until it gets close. And if I need to, then I'll use a file to push the spring down. If your sear is too tight, drill it out with a 1/8 inch drill bit. And we're good. So the screw went through the sear, through the spring, and then out the other side. We'll tighten it down so it sits flush or nice and flat on the side. And there we go. Now at this point, I will install the magnets as well. What I like to do is sand the magnet so the glue has a bit more to grip onto. If you try to glue onto a smooth surface, the glue sometimes won't bite. So I'll just take my file and lightly sand the sides of the magnets. And then I'll put a drop, just a really small drop of super glue into each of those holes. It doesn't take much. And we'll keep them connected so we can tell the polarities apart. And we'll push one into one hole, push one into the other. And if you use too much glue, you're gonna have the excess kind of ooze out of the hole. So carefully separate the magnets and then wipe off that extra glue. And let that sit and dry for a second. We're gonna do the same thing to the frame. So I am going to take these magnets and carefully put them back on to the front. And then that'll be the orientation that I need to glue these ones into the frame, the top frame, or the slide. So I'll do that again, do a little drop on either hole, and then just push those two together. And then I'll give it a little twist and I'll slide it off. And then I'll make sure there's a seated all the way, giving a little tap or a push. If they stick too far out of the frame, then your top slide might not close all the way. Not a big issue, but if you're OCD, that gap might bother you. So make sure there's a seated all the way. And then from here, I'm gonna go ahead and do the catch and then the plunger system. So the catch will sit with these flanges on the bottom. Just like that. The catch should slide in and out. It's pretty good. The catch springs will go on either side. Now you don't need much force on these catch springs, I've noticed. So as long as the catch springs are kind of flush with the top of the slide or the frame, then you're good. If it's 2 coils above, it might be too much force, but you can always trim them and test as well. So and then the top cover goes over that with the 440 in the hole. That just bites into the plastic. Don't over tighten this guy. Just gonna make it flush to the slide. And there you go. The slide should move up and down. Now for the plunger, this is something that I think is the most difficult part of the build, other than the filing and sanding, is you gotta get a seal in there and assemble it in such a way that, you know, like I said, you don't damage the parts too much. So what I like to do is I like to take the small O-ring for the seal, the smallest O-ring, and slide it on the end. Now you'll want the front of the plunger to be facing the smaller threads when we put it on. So I'll lubricate the small O-ring, because you always want to lubricate your O-rings. And then I'll slide the plunger on the side with the shorter threads. And that should slide. If it's a tight fit, again, a 9/64 drill bit will fix that. Yeah, it's a bit too tight. So I'm just gonna go ahead and hit that with a 9/64. Go. Now it should slide nice and smooth. That O-ring will seal the back of the plunger, and then we'll take our plunger core and slide it onto the back of the plunger. The threads will thread in. The reason why I assemble it on the smooth rod is because it prevents the O-ring from twisting on you, and that O-ring will seal against the plunger core, so it's nice to keep that O-ring right where you want it. So I'll twist those on. Also be careful that you don't bend the smooth rod by accident. Now, it's pretty tight, like most of these gray prints, so I will hold the core in my pliers, my wrench, and twist the plunger so it tightens down. And if it's a bit too tight, you can gently use a pair of pliers to tighten it without damaging the plunger. And there you go. Don't screw it on too far, you will crack your plunger, and it should slide. Perfect. Then you use one of the large O-rings for the plunger, and there's your plunger rod and your plunger. we'll want to use the smallest O-ring as a shock pad. So put that on the end with the shorter threads and put on your hex nut. And that acts as your shock pad. So then we'll put our spring on, and then we'll put this whole assembly into the plunger tube, and we'll make sure that the smooth rod comes out the front, just like that. And then here I will go ahead and put on my front plate onto that whole assembly, and then I'll screw on the smooth rod onto the front by screwing the hex nut from the back. So you can use a pair of pliers to hold that hex nut, or if you have a socket, you have a 5/16 socket, it fits perfectly right down in there, especially if you have a long socket. And if your pliers are too big, you may need to use a pair of needle nose pliers, or you could push this in and then screw it from the front. And it should sit so the thread on the front kind of pokes or lines up to the front there, and that's it. There you go. That's it. So now we're just going to put the whole thing together, and what we do is the rear cap will hold the back together. So we'll put the slide. I like to twist this, pull and twist it to the side. Go ahead and pull this, and you can prime it, make sure that the catch works. Yep. And then we'll go ahead and slide the top onto the frame from the back, and then we can slide the front down to the frame, and that just pushes on. And then that seats with two 440s. But before we seal that, we'll put this rear cap on. So we'll take another large O-ring and put it on the redirect. The smaller O-ring goes onto the pusher. And then, like always, we will lubricate all of our O-rings. And then what we'll do is we'll pull the top slide back. We'll put the redirect onto the rear, and it's kind of a tight fit, but I like to hold near the front of the slide and just push it and twist it, and it sits right in. Get the extra lube off there, and then that gets assembled with two 440s in the back as well. Don't over tighten these screws. Be careful you don't strip the prints, and a lot of times I find that there's a bulge. Like the redirect will make the top slide kind of flare out, so I like to hold it together to make sure the part's screwed into place properly. So just nice and tight to hold it on, not a ton of force on this part, so you don't have to tighten them too hard. Don't strip out your prints. And then that's it. That was the build. The next is the magazines. I guess we have our 440s here you can cap the end with. I like to save those for last, just in case I have to take them off. The prints I've noticed have been tight enough that you really don't even need screws on this front part, but definitely gives you peace of mind. And if your printer is dialed in such where you're a little bit under extruding and your prints are a little bit looser fit, you will probably definitely want these screws. Now if your thumb nut, to go back to this front part again, is too tight, you can heat it up with a soldering iron and then press it in a little bit. That'll help expand the prints, so you can get that in. I haven't needed to do that, and I modified the print so it's more of a press fit, and I have an arbor press, so that makes more sense to me than building a springer with a soldering iron. And there you go. Test, make sure your trigger fires. If your trigger does not fire, some troubleshooting you can do is make sure that trigger resets and it moves freely. Another thing to note is if you have unclean prints rubbing on each other, they might end up sticking and causing it not to reset the trigger or even fire. Or if your sear is not moving up enough, you might have too much spring pressure on your catch. It doesn't take much for it to catch, and your trigger should reset. And if for any reason it doesn't reset all the way, then you'll probably just want to go in and, like I said, file down that sear, because maybe the trigger's being pulled back, but then the force of the catch on top is holding the trigger down. And so you can actually put a little bit of lube in there as well. Put a little bit of lube in between the sear and the bottom of the trigger, and there you go. The last thing is a magazine. You'll just take one of your mag springs, cut it in half. I like to just kind of fold it in half and eyeball where it is. They work pretty well. They even work with a full-size mag spring. So there's not a huge worry about the length of your spring, but getting them equal means your mags will have equal pressure. And so what you'll want to do is find your floor plate. So we have our spring and our bottom and our top. The hardest thing to get the mags to work is if you have elephant's foot or layer. If you see these two, there's quite a difference in how they are printed. So this one will be louder and it may not go as smooth. So you want to make sure you don't have elephant's foot on the bottom of your follower and that they slide together pretty smooth. So just take your follower and kind of line the shapes up like that. I like to put the flat end in the magazine against the follower and then just put your base plate on. I find it easier to kind of just go straight on, just like that, and give it a push. If you go at a crooked angle, then sometimes the back won't line up, and the front won't line up. And there's the magazine. Little mag test here. You can lube it or sand it if you need to. Another thing to look out for is any gunk that you have on the overhangs on these mags here. That can make your mag eject a little bit less smooth. So cleaning any burrs off of that will make it work even better. And there you go. That is the Zinc. We'll put some rounds through it. There you go. This one hits pretty hard.